everybody. This is Lawrence from the Atheist Community in Milwaukee. And today we have a special guest, David Fitzgerald. Say hello.
Hello, Milwaukee.
David Fitzgerald is one of my favorite historians. His talks are absolutely hysterical and informative. I really suggest looking him up on YouTube. He has plenty of talks, a lot of interviews as well. So they're very insightful. So I'm lucky to have him on the show today, and we're going to talk a little bit about ancient history. How does that sound?
Fair enough.
All right. So David, how did you become an atheist?
Oh, wow. We're going all the way back to atheist
Oh
101.
yeah, we are.
Well, it's funny. I was raised Southern Baptist, and up until college, I was very devout, very fervent, total creationist, the whole nine yards. I mean, I really was in deep hook, line, and sinker. And it's a funny story. I'll try to keep it short, but basically, in a nutshell, I became an atheist because I was debating with a girl who wasn't saved, and we got in an argument on how old Hinduism was, whether it was older than Christianity or not. And I was all set to jump down her case and go, "Oh no, it's not older than Christianity." And then I stopped, and before another word got out of my mouth, I realized, I have no idea if Hinduism is older than Christianity or not. And it was that moment when I realized that I was about to say something that I didn't know if it was true or not. That just freaked me right out. And I realized, holy crap, I'm just like the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm just parroting what I was taught. And it was so bizarre. It's like, for a lot of people, it's a steady erosion. But I mean, I can remember 1 millisecond being Christian, and the next millisecond, just my eye is just saying, wow, do I even believe this at all? And it just feeling fake completely after that. It never looked the same to me after that, once I gave myself permission to ask, do I even believe this?
That is awesome, I have to say. I don't think I've ever heard a almost deconversion story like that. I mean, you started to doubt. That's incredible.
It was one of those things that I'm sure the undercurrents had been building a long time, and the pressure was building. But yeah, when it finally broke, boom! It was just, and the fun. I didn't have to, go back and start and figure things out like evolution. It's like this feeling of course, evolution was true. It's this huge weight lifted off my shoulder of trying to, just shore up all this bullshit that part of my brain clearly knew wasn't true, and to let go of that and to not have to worry about cramming the whole universe into a Southern Baptist-sized box, that was amazingly liberating.
Oh, that's fantastic. And now you are here talking about how Jesus probably never existed at all. That is just awesome.
And what's funny is, even as an atheist, if you had come to me 15 or 16 years ago and said what I say to people now, I wouldn't have believed it. I thought, that's crazy talk. Of course there was a Jesus. It wasn't until I got curious about who Jesus really was and what he really said and how much of it was just legendary BS that got added on. Can we say bullshit on this podcast?
Oh, absolutely we can.
Yeah, it wasn't until I was trying to figure out how much of the Gospels show the real Jesus and how much of it is just legendary bullshit that got created later, that I first ran into trouble. And long story short, about 2 years later than that, came to the point where it's like, okay, I don't think this guy existed at all. And then to talk to other, realizing I wasn't the first person to make that, come to that conclusion, really blew my mind.
I also get that a lot from not only, I mean, I get that especially from Christians, but from atheists, I get that a lot as well. And it seems to me like they pretty much do what theists do, like what Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses do. They just repeat what they've heard, and they say that they have solid evidence of Jesus, but then when we take a closer look, they don't. And
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
it's
And I can't tell you when the book Nailed came out. And actually, let me correct something real fast because I get a lot of crap from this from our fellow atheists. But you introduced me as a historian, and I love you for that. But I like to say that I'm a historical writer because yes, I have a degree in history, but I am not employed as an academic in the field of history.
okay.
And that didn't used to bother me, but it bothers a lot of people a lot. I never used to worry about that too much because it's not like these are my ideas. It's not like I'm saying anything that I came up with. These are things that have been floating around for a long time. Earl Doherty's been saying this. G.A. Wells was saying this. Almost as far as Christianity goes back, there have been people who have been calling bullshit on it. Here's the thing that amazed me when I got to the point where I realized, A, I don't think this guy existed, and B, took it years later to the point where I was actually writing a book saying, and these are the top 10 ways that the official story of Jesus just does not add up. Well, I didn't expect Christians to like it, and they don't. But what really shocked me was how much blowback I got from our fellow atheists. And it wasn't, it's like you said, they were acting like theists. They were acting all their bullshit alarms that they save for like moon landing denials and Holocaust deniers and anti-vaxxers, all that got aimed at me as a Jesus mythicist, because they're like, oh well, all historians agree that there was a Jesus, and those kind of myths about Jesus are so entrenched even in atheist circles. It blows my mind. Which to the point that right now I'm working on a follow-up book to Nailed called Jesus, Mything in Action, and it's taking on all the arguments that we get from atheists like Bart Ehrman and Morris Casey and other atheists that weigh in on this argument. And it always fascinates me not only how flimsy the evidence for Jesus is, but how vociferously atheists who shouldn't even have a dog in the hunt will defend it. And it really blows my mind.
Yeah, and that was really, and just to be safe here, just so you know, I got all of my bullshit detector stuff out of the way early. I talked to somebody about GMOs, and you probably know how that conversation goes. It's yeah, it was just
well, and it's good that we have them, and it's good that we call ourselves on our own communities blind spots.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the point of this discussion was to go over the supposed evidence, and you outline these in Nailed, and you outline them so well. It's very simple, because when reading something like a Carrier book, although all the answers are in the book, you have to go through it. It's pretty much like if you read the whole thing, you'll get it. If you read it out of context, it'll make some sense, but not as much, because it all folds in neatly the way that he writes it.
I hear you, and Rick knows I love him because he's awesome. But I often feel like my job in this world is to make people like Rick Carrier and Robert Price accessible to a wider audience than they got now.
Yeah.
I recommend all their books, honestly, and for that fact, I recommend most of Bart Ehrman's books too. The ironic thing is, for such a staunch historicist, he's one of the best mysticist writers out there.
The way Carrier explained it to me was that even though they have their disagreements, Ehrman does a very good job of portraying what the mainstream idea is and why.
Yep. And he does a really good job of breaking down when those presuppositions aren't based on anything that's real. And I'm hoping, actually, as more information comes out, Raphael Lattister just came out with a great book.
Yeah, actually, I was gonna ask you about that him and Carrier wrote. Jesus did not exist, that one?
That's right. And I think that book has the potential to change Bart Ehrman's mind. It's too late for Maurice Casey, of course, but Raphael does such a good job of just pointing out that so much of the arguments that Bart is basing his current stance on is based on imaginary source materials that we don't have, that may never have existed, and yet there's so much confidence put in them. One of the things Raphael said that I loved is like, okay, let's say there are these hypothetical source materials you're talking about. How do you know they agree with you? How do you know they don't agree with mythicists? How do you know they don't say, oh, and this is a work of fiction, it should not be taken seriously? It's when you look at it that way, it's laughable to see how empty the certainty is, and that's probably one of the biggest sins that we can commit as historians in the historical field is misplaced certainty. And every time I say something that turns out to be wrong, it gets slapped down, and that humiliation tempers what my stance next. And I think Bart Ehrman is due for that kind of comeuppance as well. And I love Bart. Don't get me wrong. I love the man.
Yeah, he's definitely very intelligent. And I'm definitely planning on picking up Forged at some time in the near future.
Forged is a great book, and he's got another one called Forgery and Counterforgery, which is sort of the full-blown scholarly version of that. Both of those books are amazing. And it's interesting. He's got a new book called How Jesus Became God. And it's so interesting to see that book compared to his book, Did Jesus Exist? Because in the new book, you can see that he's realizing that a lot of the things that he was accepting the consensus opinion on are not as well founded as he expected them to be. And he starts actually using arguments that mythicists have been saying for decades and employing them in the book. So it's very interesting to see him start to come around to the mythicist way of thinking. So it gives me cautious optimism that he may change his mind down the road.
Well, that is just awesome. I would definitely have to read that book as well. But now I want to get into the meat of what people use as evidence and why they use it as evidence.
Let's do it.
So, I mean, the most talked about historian, obviously, is Flavius Josephus. So to my understanding, there were apparently two sections. One of which was completely just totally stuck in there, forged. We know that it wasn't from him. And this is just to my knowledge. And then the other one is not even talking about that same Jesus.
Exactly.
So what? How do we know that? I guess expand on who Flavius Josephus is and his work.
Yeah. Here's the thing. Flavius Josephus was this Jewish historian in the first century. And the reason that we pay so much attention to him today is not just that he's a good source for the first century, but he is really, outside of the Gospels, our only historical source that's anywhere near contemporary that seems to be talking about Jesus. And that's why, even though both these references are very dodgy and suspicious, that's why Christians have dug in so hard to defend them. Because if you take out those two snippets, these very problematic, suspicious snippets, Christians have nothing for the entire first century to corroborate what's being said in the Gospels. So that's a huge amount of why Josephus seems to loom bigger than he might. Like you said, there's two passages that Christians point to. One is called the Testimonium, the Testimonium Flavinium, and it is a paragraph in the middle of a history book that Josephus wrote in the 90s, and it seems to be talking about Jesus. It says, there was at this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful, call him man, because he was so awesome, and blah, 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 and our leaders amongst us had him killed, and his followers still loved him, and their tribe named after him still continues to this day. Everyone who's looked at this knows that it can't be real at face value. They just know that a Jewish historian, a Pharisee, would never have said all these glowing things about Jesus. And there's lots of other reasons to be suspicious about it. But what they try to do, and for the life of me, I don't understand why secular historians fall for this is that they try to say, well, it's only a partial forgery, and that they try to separate what was the forged parts from the original part, which is kind of a wild goose chase for starters. But let's leave that alone, because there's a couple points about it I want to make. First of all, Bart Ehrman, who's a staunch historicist, even he says that, you know what, everything, let's say this whole thing wasn't forged at all. Let's say it's 100% true and genuine. It's not saying anything that he wouldn't have found out from your average Christian on the street around the end of the first century when this was written. So there's that for starters, that it's not saying anything that new. It's clearly based on Christian preaching. But more to the point, medieval early church fathers loved Josephus. They loved quoting him. They loved quoting him for evidence on John the Baptist, but they never quote him on evidence for Jesus. In fact, one of the early church fathers even complains that Josephus, being a Jew, didn't believe in Jesus and never mentions anything he did. This same church father also said, well, of course, Jesus did all these amazing and wonderful things, but what evidence do we have of it outside the Gospels? And the reason that's suspicious is because this same church father, his name was Origen, his book, his copy of Josephus, was passed down to a guy in the 3rd century named Eusebius. Eusebius is the first person to make this quote. And for 500 years, for half a millennia, no other Christian father, even though they comment plenty on Josephus and rely on Josephus for their arguments, no one ever notices that there's this commercial for Jesus right in the middle of this history book for 500 years until Jerome. That alone, for me, is a hint and a half that this thing was forged and that Eusebius was the forger. And we can. There's other arguments to unpack, but it's hard for me to dismiss that one alone. So that's the testimonium. The other passage is called the James reference, and what it is talking about a Jewish religious leader in Jerusalem, James the Just, who gets killed unfairly, sentenced to death, and the town is so upset that they make another guy high priest, his brother high priest. Well, when you read the story, they say who they're talking about in there. I should say this James, in the middle of the passage, it says James, who was the brother of Christ. There's a partial line that says that. But when you read the story, first of all, it says who it's talking about. The Jesus in question is not Jesus, the brother of James, who was called Christ. It's Jesus, son of Damnius. Everything about that story makes sense if this is about Jesus, son of Damnius. His brother was unfairly killed, and so to make up for it and to pacify the Jewish population, they made his brother Jesus high priest in his place. Makes perfect sense. But if this is supposed to be about Jesus's brother James, the early Christian church leader who was later said to be Jesus's brother, then it makes no sense, because all our Christian references say that he was killed by a lynch mob, not sentenced to death. It says all the conditions are different. You've got Jewish people who were upset about this guy being killed, this James being killed, that there was near riots in the streets, and yet Christianity was supposed to be illegal at this time. So why were the Jews getting upset over some hated sect leader? You know, it'd be like the Hare Krishna's leader being lynched and the Christians being up in arms about it. So it makes no sense if it's about it makes no sense if it's about James, the brother of Jesus.
I didn't actually... You know, I think I must have skipped over that part where it said... you said it was the son of... How do you pronounce it? Is it with the D?
Damnius.
Damnius, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I actually didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. And to be honest with you, it blows my mind to get when I have... let's try that again. It blows my mind that I get so much pushback from atheists who try to tell me, oh, no, that's an actual reference to Jesus. It makes no sense whatsoever if it's about our James, the brother of Jesus.
Yeah, and that's... I think what's it called? Where if you know less about a subject, you think you know more because if you know more, what is that called?
There is some fallacy about that.
Uh,
It's something.
It's like
It's about
this
the, it's
some
the
Dunning
same thing
Kruger.
that makes you think you're a snappier driver than you think you are. What makes dumb people realize they're not smart.
Dunning Kruger. Is it the Dunning Kruger effect? I think it's
Johnny,
called.
thank you,
Yeah.
thank you.
All
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
it's
All right.
yeah, it's not unlike that at all.
So there are I think there was one around the same time as Josephus, right? Was it a Clement of Rome?
Clement of Rome was supposedly writing around the end of the first century, though there is some question about if he really did write it.
Okay, okay. What it was attributed to him?
Well, the interesting thing about Clement is he says things about Jesus, but when he's offering quotes from Jesus, most of the time it doesn't quite add up to what our verses say. For instance, he says something that in our gospel is a mashup of two different verses. And he never says that he's quoting the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel, which other Gospel. He's only saying he's quoting the Lord. And every other time that he's quoting the Lord, he's making quotes from the Old Testament. So it's a very problematic and weird thing for him to be doing. That he would not get a Bible verse right and make a mistake like that, unless those Gospels weren't quite finished yet. Or if they were coming from a different source altogether and later made it into the Gospels. I was going to say more, but that's it in a nutshell, really.
No, you can say more if you want. Go ahead.
No. Let's leave it at that.
All right. So another one that I hear almost consistently. I'm part of a lot of debate groups because that's just who I am, and and the thing that always keeps getting brought up is Tacitus.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess who is Tacitus and how do we know, or how do we come to the conclusion that the evidence that's demonstrated by him, I'm not saying that right, whatever, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
How do we know that's
why
flawed? Yeah.
Concerned with what he says and doesn't say. Well, one interesting thing about the Tacitus paragraph, it's a paragraph talking about Nero blaming the fire of Rome on a group called the Christians. One interesting thing Rick Carrier pointed out a while back is that in early Christian writings, when they talk about persecutions, they don't talk about that incident. And there's some indications that maybe this passage wasn't talking about Christians originally at all, but talking about Jews or some other group altogether. And it was later switched to become a martyr story about Christians. Candida Moss wrote a great book called The Myth of Persecution, in which she goes through all the Christian persecution stories from the dawn of time to today, and
Wow.
points out that the church itself investigated these and pretty much has rejected almost every single one of them, especially the further you go back, the farther you go back, the less likely they are to be true. And the more likely they are to be ripped off from like pagan martyr stories or Jewish martyr stories, which is fascinating. And that may be the case with Tacitus. But again, Tacitus, let's say what he's writing is genuine and not a forgery, not a misattributed thing, and he really did talk about the Christians. Again, he is saying something that clearly comes from Christian preaching, that the Christians worship a guy who was killed under Pontius Pilate. Let me back up a little bit. Let me break that down a little bit more. Christians point to that as evidence that Tacitus did research and knew that Pontius Pilate, was really in charge and he really did crucify Jesus. But Tacitus, let me rephrase that. But what they're forgetting is that Tacitus, again, is just saying what Christians of his time were saying. And we know that, well, first of all, he's not talking about Christians and Christianity. He's talking about Rome and this fire in Rome. He's not going to go into the archives and check out, now, who was this guy and when did this happen? This was not common knowledge, and there was no reason for him to have to do the research he would have to do to find out that, oh, yes, Pontius Pilate really did crucify Jesus, for several reasons. One, the Romans wouldn't have kept records like that. They wouldn't have cared if Pontius Pilate crucified Jews. He was crucifying Jews all the time. And what's more, the records archives where he would have gotten that information, he would have had to send somebody there. They would have had to dug through hundreds of years of archives material to find it. This is in a day before the Dewey Decimal System and before the internet. And what's more, the Roman archives had burned down in the meantime. So there was no way that we have any evidence, any archival evidence that he could have gotten that from. He only would have gotten it from Christians.
Okay. Now I'm on board. All right. Yeah. So next, I guess I want to talk about, in one of your talks, you were talking about how there was a silence until a certain point, I guess. So one of my favorite ones, and this isn't exactly a silence, but I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. So Lucian of Samosata, I hope I'm saying that right.
Love that man, yeah.
All right. And he was a satirist, right?
Right. And he's much later than either of these people we've been talking about so far, too. He's not a good example of the silence, but let's talk about Lucian anyway, because he's kind of awesome.
Yeah. So the way I understand it is he satirized Christianity when he went to Judea, right? Or he went to some part of that area, and he discovered Christianity.
Here's what happened. There was a guy named Peregrinus, and he did not like Peregrinus because he thought he was a pompous tool and just a big windbag. And so when Peregrinus died, he wrote a satire about his life. And one of the things he says in there is that Peregrinus became a Christian leader, and because Christians are so gullible and stupid, he immediately became one of their leaders, wrote much of the scripture, and we're just fleecing them left and right. And so it kills me, first of all, that Christians, when they point to Lucian, they're talking about a guy whose idea of being a witness for Jesus is somebody in the 3rd century saying, yeah, that crucified guy, the Christians worship. That's the kind of thing he says about it. That's almost a word-for-word quote. He calls him a sophist, which is like a word for a fake philosopher, bogus philosopher who cons people. And for starters, like you said, he's a satirist. It's like asking Jerry Seinfeld to be a witness for Jesus, 300 years after the fact.
Now I'm just trying to
all
imagine.
The historian system, but stand-up comedian is going to give us the true story. And if you read what he has to say about Christians don't want to hear what he's saying about Christians, because even back then in the 3rd century, they had a reputation for just being totally gullible and believing anything.
Well, not much has changed. So on the topic of satirists, were there any other ones at the time, or a little after or before?
Well, yeah. In fact, there were earlier ones like Martial and Juvenal, but they don't mention Christians. And they're not to make an argument of silence, but I do, in fact, list all these different Romans and pagan and Jewish writers who had reason to notice Jesus and for some reason didn't. It's not good enough to just say, oh, well, Jesus wasn't mentioned by this guy, and do a laundry list of Romans, because they have to have a reason that we would expect them to take notice of Jesus. And in my opinion, there's plenty that do make that cut. It's interesting, in the new book, I don't even bring up that information because I've got so much positive information to talk about that I don't need to talk about the lack of information.
Right. All right. Well, that's and this is now we can kind of get into the whole silence thing.
Yeah, let's get into that for a second, because let me just break that down for a little bit.
Sure.
What I mean by that silence is that for the first 150 to 250 years of Christianity, from the whole first century to the middle of the second century, we don't have any original texts of New Testament writings. We don't have anything like that. We have fragments up until the end of the second century, over 150 years after Christianity began, that we start to get complete books of the Bible. And it's not until the 4th century that we get a complete New Testament. And that we actually have 2 copies of that. One's called the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus. Now, the interesting thing about those 2 books is not just that they're the first complete New Testaments that we have, but that they don't agree with each other. One has books the other one doesn't have. The other one has books the other one doesn't have. And both of them disagree with our New Testament. We have books they don't have. They have books we don't have. So it's even gnarlier than that. And so we're talking for hundreds and hundreds of years, from the first century to the end of the second century, we don't have any way of knowing, first of all, how closely our texts match the originals.
Well, wasn't there correct me if I'm wrong, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, wasn't that a closer, I guess I think I heard Robert Price say this. He said that I have no idea how old they are. I have absolutely no idea about the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think I heard him saying how they weren't actually that much different from what we have today.
Well, they're not different from what they have today, but here's the thing. The Dead Sea Scrolls don't have any New Testament books in them at all.
Okay.
What they have are from the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures.
Okay.
They have that. They also have apocryphal books from the intertestamental period, and they have some other later Jewish writings. And they do a pretty good job of matching up with the ancient Hebrew texts, but there's no overlap with the New Testament at all. And some partial scrolls, there were historians in the 30s and 40s who tried to say, "Oh, this is a New Testament scroll." And it's like, that is not held up at all. It's just not true at all. So the Dead Sea Scrolls have no bearing on the New Testament whatsoever.
Okay. That's good to know. So I want to, I keep hearing this name come around a lot. Gallio. I think that's how you pronounce it, right?
Okay. Are you talking about the judge who sentenced Paul in
Yes.
in the New Testament?
Yes.
Yes. Gallio. Yeah.
Okay. So I his name comes up a lot in these discussions, but I don't really know much about him other than what you just said. Because I hear him come up a lot as evidence.
Well, the interesting thing about that is Gallio should have been good witness to Paul, but he only shows up in the book of Acts. In Gallio's own writings, we never hear anything about any trial with Paul. Luke has a really bad habit of name dropping famous first century celebrities in the book of Acts. And Gallio is definitely one of those. And he was actually connected to other historians at the time. So if you really did have a trial with Paul and was so blown away by Paul as he is in the book of Acts, our historian friends would have written about it. And yet we don't have any connection to Paul in any contemporary non-extra biblical source at all. Man, my voice is just going out.
That's all right. All right. So actually, that actually kind of leads into what I want to talk about next. Paul. So there are 13 letters, right? And
There's 13 letters attributed to Paul, but it turns out that he only wrote 6 of them.
6 of them. Okay.
Sorry, 7 of them.
Okay.
7 of
Okay.
them. And the others are forgeries. And even the ones that are genuinely Paul appear to be mashups of different letters. So even his genuine letters have been edited, and even his genuine letters contain interpolations that are things he never said.
I think it's in Galatians, but there's one part that always amuses me, how it goes in. I forget who's talking, or I forget what's going on exactly, what's being talked about, but the passage ends in, remember to something something something, and then the next passage starts with, yes, but remember I told you, and then it just repeats the same thing. So it's very clear that something was taken out of there.
Right. My favorite of those things like that is in one of the letters. It says, "Now watch out for people who write fake letters. I'm signing this with my own hand, so you'll know this is a real letter, not a fake letter." And that's in one of the letters that's accepted as fake. So, and it's kind of a catch-22, because it's like, that's the symbol that we can identify as true letters. Well, that means all these other letters don't have it, so those are fake Paul. But if that's not true, that means this is a fake Paul. So either way, we know there are fake letters that Paul didn't write, because Paul is telling us there are fake letters and watch out for them. So you can't really deny that there's forgeries in the New Testament.
It's like playing some weird game. Oh, that's ridiculous.
That's the thing. The layers of craziness are so deep and so pernicious. You just feel like you're taking crazy pills after a while. It's like, how does anyone take this book seriously at all?
It's really crazy. And the thing, especially about how it's written. I mean, it's pretty hard to notice unless you actually read the thing straight through. But it is set up like a narrative. The entire thing is set up like a narrative.
Right.
At least the Gospels are, at least.
The Gospel. And when you put them side by side, it's a lot more obvious that the first 3 are all copied from each other. In fact, that Mark was the inspiration for Matthew and Luke, and that John took the same story and says, "Yeah, I'm not going to do any of that." He doesn't even try to keep up with the other guys, and has Jesus going off and doing his own thing, his own timeline. But yeah, when you lay them side by side, it's very obvious that Matthew and Luke are cutting and pasting bits of Mark and then blowing up the story in ways that they like, and adding to it and making corrections to Mark. And that's not an atheist came up with that. That's something that's been the majority opinion of all biblical scholars for over 100 years, probably closer to 200 years actually, called the synoptic problem. And that's the first 3 Gospels are so alike, you can trace, where they got from. There's all these sorts of theories going around about how they must have used Mark and these other sources, these other oral traditions or these other proto sources. But these imaginary sources, again, we've never found them. They're strictly hypothetical. And it's Occam's razor to say that, well, no, Luke is just stealing from Matthew and Mark here and just taking his own editorial decisions with them.
Yeah, assuming makes an ass out of you and me, right? Going a little bit deeper on Paul here. Wow, that came out wrong.
Don't get me started on Paul. Don't.
All right, so I think the Bible is filled with so many names that sooner or later they all kind of blend together, right? Like I had a friend that confused Job and Lot.
Oh wow!
And it's just and it's easy to confuse.
It is, and there's so many of them have the same name. That's hard to keep up with them.
Yeah. So
all the James and the Johns and the.
So I guess the question is: so who was Paul? Why was he important?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, for us, Paul seems to be the oldest Christian writer. I mean, there were probably other people writing at the time, but for some reason, we don't know about them. We don't know about Apollos of Alexandria, what he had to say. We don't know about the other preachers that it mentions. We don't know about his rival preachers who were preaching another Christ and another Jesus. We hear him complain about them, but we don't know anything about who these people were or what they were preaching and who they were preaching about. For some reason, for whatever reason, Christians decided to only preserve Paul's writings and those writings that are in Paul's name, that were forged in his name. And for the first 60 years or so of Christianity, he's the only one that we get any kind of writing preserved for him. So that's what makes him important to us. He wasn't the first Christian. He wasn't the inventor of Christianity. But he was in that first early generation of Christians.
So the way that he's talked about is that he is someone who's actually is a contemporary.
Well, if there had been a Jesus alive in the year 30, Paul would have been alive to know him. I mean, he makes it clear that he never met Jesus. In fact, we don't get any hint from his writings that Jesus was ever on earth for him to meet. Even when he talks about people that we think of as Jesus's friends and family, he talks about them, the leaders of the Jerusalem church, like they're nobodies, like they're not even real Christians, and he doesn't like them. And in Galatians, he's constantly at loggerheads with them and says, "Oh, I didn't give it to them for a second, because they're fake believers." But and it's like, what? When you read what he has to say about these guys, it's astounding that this guy's supposed to be James, the brother of the Lord, and then 2 paragraphs later, he's saying, "I don't know who these guys think they are. They're nobody to me." It's like, that's crazy buckets if these guys are supposed to be Jesus's disciples and relatives. It makes a lot more sense if those names came from Paul's letters, guys who were leaders of the Jerusalem church, and decades later, when Mark is writing his gospel, he picks those names as people who were disciples of Jesus. Paul never even uses the word disciple or hints that there were such things as disciples. When he talks about apostles, he's talking about people who had a vision of the Lord. He considers himself an apostle because he had a vision of the Lord. The Lord spoke to him. And when he talks about the apostles, he's not talking about the 12 guys who hung around with Jesus. He's talking about people who had visions of Jesus just like he did.
And that clears up a lot of things for me, because I knew that there was obviously a difference between disciple and apostle. I just had no idea what it was. So
nowadays we kind of tend to blend them together and say, oh, the apostles were the 12 disciples. But that's not how the early Christians said it. That's not what their idea was. Today, those two words are conflated into one thing.
All right. So since we know that 6 of the letters were forged, do we have any ideas on who wrote them?
Well, we've got some vague ideas. Some of them are close enough to what Paul actually says in his genuine letters that we call them pseudo-Paulines or Judo-Paulines. It was some kind of follower of Paul saying more or less the same kind of things he would say, and that's like Ephesians and Colossians. Others go completely against what Paul said. So like 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, those come much later. They describe things in Christianity that weren't around in Paul's time after he died, structures like bishops and things like that weren't involved with Christianity until decades later. And there's disagreements between the fake Paul letters and the real genuine Pauline letters.
I guess, do we have any ideas on when the letters were written?
Good idea. Well, we know those were written the ones that are closest to his way of thought, the Pseudo-Paulines, were probably written a few decades after he died, sometime in the 60s. The pastoral letters, Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, they were written probably early 2nd century, sometime when the structures were in place that just weren't in existence during Paul's time.
Okay.
And again, I just want to say, even in Paul's genuine letters, there's the odd interpolation here and there where there's something anachronistic that gets said, or something that's very un-Pauline that gets inserted. Like there's one where at one point he's talking and all of a sudden he goes off on the Jews, they're so bad, they crucified Jesus, and now they're getting their comeuppance. And it's like, whoa, where did that Tourette's come from? And they're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which didn't happen until after Paul was dead. So clearly he never wrote that. And it's just some monk ranting on the margin of a manuscript that got stuck into the manuscript. That kind of interpolation happened all the time. It wasn't even active forgery. A monk found it and said, oh, I see this note here at the end, I have to insert it here. And they didn't realize it's just somebody doing commentary. Which is probably how that reference in Josephus to James, the brother of the Lord, got in. That was probably just a monastic scribal note on the side of the margin that got accidentally interpolated. Things like that happened all the time in ancient and medieval manuscripts. And Richard Carrier actually had done some really good studies on showing how that happened in ancient manuscripts very easily.
Yeah, wasn't there something similar in, I think, Carrier shows in, was it the Ascension of, was it Isaiah? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The Ascension of Isaiah is a fascinating document because, well, first of all, there's many layers of it. It's been interpolated and Christianized, but the oldest layers of it seem to be talking about a Jesus who starts in one of the seventh heavens or the third heavens. I forget how many heavens are actually in that particular document, but he has to go from layer of heaven to layer of heaven to layer of heaven and be killed in each one so that he can descend to a lower level each time. And that seems a lot like the Jesus that Methodists are saying Christians originally worshipped, a God who did all these things on the mythical plane, like Hercules doing his 12 labors, or if you look at the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, that Jesus in there that he describes is doing everything, making his sacrifice in heaven, in the heavenly temple, outside the gate. There's nothing to tie him to a earthly Jesus. And in fact, they say things like, now, if he had been on earth, he would have been a priest, or he wouldn't have been a priest because we have priests already. It's constantly saying how this is all happening in heaven and would have to have happened in heaven because in heaven, it's the true reality, and we're just shadows and images of that reality. So Jesus couldn't have died on earth. It's fascinating to reread the book of Hebrews with the idea that maybe he's not talking about the Jesus that we talk about. It's amazing to see the different perspective you get.
Yeah, and that's really the idea that it's hard to get across to a lot of people is that he would have been more of a celestial being, the way he used to be talked about. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's funny, the New Testament is filled like that. Throughout the letters of Paul and the other epistles, you get a vision of Jesus that's not like what you get from the Gospels. And when you read the Gospels first and then try to read back into the epistles, you have to kind of do some adjusting to make it fit. But if you recognize that the Gospels were all written, every one of them was written decades and decades after Christianity began. And the further you go back to Paul's letters, those are the oldest Christian writings we have. And the oldest bits of them, the pre-Pauline elements, if you will, they talk about a Jesus who's so different from that we get in the Gospels.
Yeah, and that's really a point that I find is harder to stress because most of the theists you and I talk to they probably don't know their holy book. It's just
it's funny. I mean, Christians. Well, first of all, there's so many Christians that don't read their scripture, and as an atheist, does that not drive you apeshit?
Yeah,
it's like, how the hell? Why is it we have to know your goddamn book better than you do? That drives me crazy, for starters. But read the New Testament especially, but it's the same with the Old Testament. Again and again and again, you come across things that you have to explain away. You have to make allowance. You have to kind of massage it and twist it to make sense or to make it fit the story we get in the Gospels. And then, of course, if you read the Gospels side by side, you realize they aren't agreeing with each other. And it's not just that they are saying, well, Paul says, Jesus was wearing a blue T-shirt, and Matthew says it was a red T-shirt, and Luke says it was a green T-shirt. It's like, no, these are profound differences on who Jesus was and what he said and how he acted and what he did. And when he did it, did he do it?
His nativity, for crying out loud.
The nativity, sure. But even the other end, when Jesus' death, if you read the motives the reasons they give for him being executed are different from gospel to gospel. And in John's gospel, that's the real huge difference, because his Jesus is doing things that don't even happen in the other gospels. In the last couple weeks of Jesus' life are nothing alike in John's gospels and in the other gospels. John's Jesus gets executed primarily because he's resurrected Lazarus from the dead. That freaks out the Sanhedrin, and they decide, oh, we've got to kill him. And his whole story for those 2 weeks or so is about that. Well, in the other gospels, Lazarus doesn't even exist. That never happens. Lazarus is the name of a character in one of the parables that Jesus tells in Luke, but there is no Lazarus to be resurrected from the dead. That's not why the Sanhedrin goes after him and the Pharisees go after him. It's completely different. And people who are impressed by, oh, look at the layer of detail in these Gospels. It's so detailed, it must be true. Well, compare the details and you'll see, well, they couldn't possibly be doing this at this day if this other Gospel says he was over here doing something else over here. Just trying to cram together all the different accounts of his trial and his execution and his resurrection. Dan Barker has a great thing called the Easter Challenge, where he says, okay, let's say it's true. Here's what I want you to do. Tell me what happened, but don't leave anything out from any of the Gospels. And you can't do it because the Gospels contradict themselves irreparably.
That's... I never heard of that challenge. Huh, okay. That's a very cool idea. Good job, Dan Barker.
Yeah, and there's just one rule. You can't, if it's in the gospel, you can't leave it out. You can't leave it out. So tell me what happened. And if you do that, you'll have them running back and forth to the tomb. Try it at home. It's a fun game. But it becomes quickly obvious that somebody's not telling the truth here. Someone doesn't get their story right. And again, we have to remember the oldest gospel we have is the Gospel of Mark. That was written around the year 70, sometime after the year 70, after the Jewish war with Rome, maybe in response to the Jewish war with Rome. So probably sometime in the 70s of the first century. All the other gospels come later and follow him. Luke, we know, had to have been written after the 90s because he steals details from Josephus, from that very same book that he wrote in the year 93 or 94. So there's no way in hell Luke was written as early as the 90s. It had to have been written after that.
And didn't Mark also take from Josephus? At least about didn't he take Jesus from Josephus's Jewish war? Because wasn't there Jesus in there?
I know what you're talking about. That's the theory of Joseph Atwill, who wrote Caesar's Messiah. And his idea was that Jesus was all these gospels were just this real clever play on Josephus's writings, and that they all were a secret Roman plot to I don't know, pacify the Jews or something. It really, the thing about Joseph Atwill's book, and this is true of so many different kind of Jesus myth. Not all Jesus myth is created equal. Just because they're saying Jesus didn't exist doesn't mean what they are saying is complete nonsense. And that's how I feel about the idea that Jesus came from as a Roman plot out of Josephus. If you're smart enough to concoct this theory, you've got to be smart enough to know that you're ignoring decades and decades of Jewish and pagan religious evolution that was in place long before Josephus ever showed up. So that that kind of thing drives me crazy, trying to keep up with all the bullshit Jesus myth out there. And I get why some atheists are through the whole idea and throwing up their hands, because there is a lot of bullshit out there and always has been.
I don't think we're talking about the same thing, actually, because this was actually, I'm not sure who Carrier's source, but it was in Carrier's book where he talked about a Jesus of Jerusalem in Josephus's Jewish War.
You're talking about Jesus ben Annaeus. Yes, that could be a source for Jesus. What happened is, in the Jewish War, Josephus describes this man who was a prophet in Jerusalem. Actually, he was a local madman. They said he was a local yokel, just quite an ordinary yokel, and yet at one point he gets touched in the head and goes around saying, "Woe unto Jerusalem." And he finally gets rounded up by the authorities. They whip him. He never says a word in protest, and they finally said, "All right, let him go." And he continues to be allowed to wander around. And then during the Jewish War, he gets hit by a catapult boulder and gets killed. It's an interesting story. It's, on the face of it, it's not really obvious connection to Jesus until you go down and match all the different similarities they have. It's like, oh, they both died at Passover. They both came to Jerusalem. There's all these interesting little points of comparison. For instance, the trial, especially the trial where he's beaten and doesn't say anything. You can see how that could have been an influence on Mark. And I do mention that in the new book. And that's entirely possible. It's not a dead cert, but it's certainly worth looking into.
And speaking of dead certainties, Shroud of Turin, what's up with that?
Oh, the Shroud of Turin. It's crazy to me that there's some myths out there that just will not die. And it's like, the Shroud of Turin has been debunked so thoroughly. We know it was a 13th century forgery. We know how they did it, and it's painted on, and it's on, what kind of paint they used and what kind of cloth they used. And yet they still act like it's some big, huge mystery that science will never figure out. It's like, no, that's not true. We figured it out. It's a forgery. And you can add that to all the pieces of the true cross, the nails of the cross, the foreskins of Jesus. Last I heard, there was about 14 foreskins of the infant Jesus when he was circumcised. And the medieval world was just floating with relics like these.
Hey, it's kind of like how many arcs we have now.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, and it's funny, is even back in the day, I think it was Jerome one of the church fathers said that if you took all these fragments of the true cross, you could build a boat out of them, a sailing boat out of them. There's so many of them. And it's funny, none of that started until the 3rd century when Constantine's mother, Helena, came to the Holy Land. And she was the one who kicked off all of the relics and all the pilgrimages. That all happened during that time, hundreds of years after Christianity was on the map.
I've heard so much from Christians. All they can talk about, well, not all they can talk about, but they talk about the Shroud of Turin a lot. And I go online, and Google's no help because it just searches for the most popular things. Right. So all I find
it's like arguing with Mormons about archaeology. It's like, dude, come on. This is day one stuff. There's just no way this is true.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I wanted to get that out of the way. I wanted to have an actual answer there.
Gotcha.
But I think that is all the actual questions I have for you. So this part of the show I like to call shameless plugs. So you can plug you can plug whatever you want. You can do your thing. Any places you're speaking soon. Just go ahead and you do you.
I would love to plug. Right now, as we speak, I'm working on a follow-up book to Nailed. It's called Jesus, Mything in Action. And it, like I said earlier, it takes on all of the arguments that we get from atheists who try to tell me that we have good reason to think there was a Jesus. And I talk about how that's not true and how, excuse me, I talk about how that's not true. And not only that, but there's good reasons why biblical historians, for the most part, aren't on board with Jesus myth. And it's one of these things, it's kind of a Bart Ehrman moment, because he pulls the curtain on how biblical studies works, and you see the biblical historians freak out because it's like, oh, no, we don't do that. We just don't tell people we do that, you know. Jesus Mything in Action doesn't just talk about the atheist arguments for Jesus, but it looks at the state of Jesus studies and what a clusterfuck that has been since the beginning, and how it continues to be, and how even though we've been studying Jesus for hundreds of years, we seem to know less and less the more we study about him. And the book will talk about that as well. It's if you like Nailed, I think you're going to love Jesus Mything in Action. And for everybody who hated Nailed, especially atheists, I think they will love Jesus Mything in Action.
All right, any places that you're speaking at soon?
I'm trying to avoid speaking gigs for the most part and just working on finishing the book and some other writing projects. But I know for sure I'll definitely be in Milwaukee this fall when Robert Price and Bart Ehrman have their debate. That's going to be a not to be missed event.
Oh yeah, I'm going to have fun setting up the chairs for that one.
I'll probably be right there with you.
All right. So that is our time. Thank you so much, David, for joining me today. It's been a long time coming.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the patience.
Yeah. It was definitely worth the wait. This is definitely a great talk. And for everyone watching, thank you so much. If you stuck through it, it was an hour long. Yeah, if you stuck through it, good for you. I'm proud of you. And your present at the end of the video is me blowing kisses. So there you go. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a good one. If you like the content, so you can subscribe to this channel, Facebook, Twitter. You have a good one.